Shower Posse. Hierarchy. Lester Jim Brown Coke, deceased. Vivian Blake, deceased. Mark Jarty Coke, deceased. Richard Storyteller Morrison, deported to Jamaica after serving 22 years, upon being extradited in 1991. Maxwell Bogle, incarcerated, on May 4, 1999, after a jury trial. Maxwell Bogle was sentenced to an aggregate term of 50 years to life for, inter alia, the crimes of kidnapping in the first degree, rape in the first degree, 3 counts, and sodomy in the first degree and possession of firearms. Bogle's conviction and sentence were affirmed on direct appeal under the name People v. Ellis, 305 AD 2D 208, 1st Department 2003, and leave to appeal to the Court of Appeals was denied. People vs. Bogle, 100 NY 2D 579, 2003. Thereafter, Bogle petitioned for a federal writ of habeas corpus, which was also denied. Bogle vs. Zn, 2007 WL 2049886, SDNY July 17, 2007. Roughkiggle Kirk Bruce, incarcerated. According to some reports, Roughkiggle Kirk Bruce is said to have confessed to over 100 murders, of which over 80 of those bodies were said to have been recovered or accounted for. However, Bruce, 39 in 2001, and already serving a life sentence in Maryland for 5 of his murders, was indicted by a Broward grand jury, Florida, for yet another count of first-degree murder, which occurred some 16 years earlier. In March of 1985, the shooting took place at a reggae party held at the rented Fort Lauderdale Fire Department's Benevolent Association Hall, and took the life of Peter Foggy, then 24, who was shot at least 6 times. Bruce was originally sentenced to die in the gas chamber and serve 4 life terms and 130 years in prison for his role in a drug-related killing of 4 men and a woman, and the wounding of a second woman on January 22, 1988. The sentence, which was imposed by Judge Jacob S. Levin, was likely the toughest ever imposed by a judge upon a single defendant in Prince George's Circuit Court, said several courthouse analysts. Mr. Bruce, Levin said upon his sentence, "It is my intention that you never, ever are allowed in free society again. All of the sentences are to run consecutively. Of the 4 life sentences, 3 are to be served without the possibility of parole." DUDUS and arms. Without its own arms, no principality is secure. Niccolo Machiavelli, 1469 to 1527. No one knows for sure if DUDUS ever read Machiavelli, but according to reports, investigations, and from those who knew him best, DUDUS was a well-read and very well-informed individual. But regardless if he had ever read the book or not, somewhere along the way, he learnt and made the above principle extremely real in his life. This was the reality of being the Don, the way it was, the way it remained, and going against that would be nothing short of imprudent. It was what it was, and his position called for. The Shower Posse, DUDUS's inheritance, was literally born out of the barrel of the gun, and with the posse's wealth reaching into the hundreds of millions, according to DEA estimations, during the bloody drug-dealing 1980s, and they acquiring unthinkable firepower both at home and abroad. DUDUS not only became a Don in 1992, he also became the gatekeeper of an arsenal of firepower that in reality was enough to start a mini-revolution. History lesson. Violence has always been commonplace in ghettos all across Jamaica, and in no other place was it more prevalent than across the politically tense regions of Jamaica's western Kingston during the 1960s. Even before there was a Tivoli Gardens there was a Don or an area leader as they are also called. Many have come and gone, individuals like Alvin George Gordon, Mickey Jack, Desmond Page, George Rock Dynall, Donovan Jones, Left Hand and Hutch, are just a few names that may get mentioned in a conversation of this nature, but regardless who is mentioned or who isn't, when it comes to the notorious Hall of Fame, many older Western Kingston residents all agree that the lineage has to start with Zaki, the High Priest, the first notable top-ranking, as thugs were also called back then, from Western Kingston to be affiliated with the Jamaica Labour Party. His reign, like most to follow, was violent and short. Zaki was killed in the political eruption that was fostered by the 1967 general election, which saw the JLP claiming victory, walking away with 33 of the 53 parliamentary seats. Zaki was also the mentor to Claudie Massop, or Jack, as Zaki affectionately called him. After Zaki's demise, it was time for the young Massop, his protege, to take control of the reigns of terror, which he did, and eventually, like Zaki, became a victim of his own handiwork, violence. Massop's death gave way to Carl Byar Mitchell, who quickly gave way to Lester Lloyd Jim Brown Coke, who gave way to his son, Mark Anthony Jarty Coke, ultimately arriving at the doorsteps of the Oval Office of the President himself, Michael Christopher DUDUS Coke. The road that led to the presidency was one littered with violence and intimidation, disputes, disagreements, shouting matches, stabbings, shoppings, hackings, shootings, fire-bombed houses, rapes, tortures, robberies, extortions, murders, and overall mayhem. But within all this, one key lessons learnt by almost all residents of the ghetto, was just how powerful of a tool a gun always was, regardless of the conflict that may arise. DUDUS too learnt from an early age the power of the gun, but unlike many, he also knew that the power of a gun does not lie only in its usage, but also, and at times even more so, in the factor of intimidation that it possesses just by being present. He also saw that others were willing to use them on his behalf, if he was able to supply them, so like a true general, the decision was made to put this tested and proven lesson into effect. DUDUS' plan was simple. He knew he couldn't be seen everywhere with a dozen or more men around him, this would make him an automatic target. He also knew that he couldn't monitor everything himself, so he decided to go about it in an entirely different way, by having a dozen or more dons, all over, under his control, answering only to him, doing for him what he really wanted nothing to do with anyway. The whole pettiness that came with the expanding territories now under his control. DUDUS knew the desire of almost every man was the same when it came to power. The urge to rule resides in all, and with this reality realized, his plan worked like a charm. The Don was willing to share power, at least so it seemed. Not just give commands, and with this perceived reality accepted by all who were handpicked to be a part of the newly formed alliance, they became ecstatic, never once realizing that what they were given power over, was always high on the list of things DUDUS cared little or nothing about. It was all a ploy, an act of masterful manipulation on DUDUS's part, and became yet another power move that enforced the type of loyalty that is still said to be alive and well, at least to some extent, in the very place of its birth, Tivoli Gardens. Being educated separated DUDUS from the start. Most of his peers were high school dropouts or worse, their education level stopped somewhere around the 6th grade or middle school, so his views were way different from theirs. He saw what the others didn't, and he also saw the mistakes of those before him. He also had enough time to devise a plan to capitalize, which is exactly what he did. Every man was a boss in his own right, at least so it's believed, and in the circles that are being discussed in this volume, regardless how much of a boss a man may believe he was, is or proclaimed to be. If he was going to say anything and be taken serious in the ghetto, oftentimes it took the addition of a gun to solidify that position, and with DUDUS being the new Don, he had plenty of both. Guns at his disposal and plenty of men who wanted to solidify their positions by putting them to work. After the influx of illegal weapons into Jamaica, starting in the late 70s and escalating into the early to mid-80s, coupled with the elevation of the Shower Posse's wealth and their fetish for guns, by the time DUDUS came to power, it's believed that Tivoli Gardens was operating like a well-oiled militia, guns are ready, so to put it simply. There was an excess of weapons at DUDUS's disposal, and according to sources, like the general he now was, he distributed them to an all too willing cast of dubious characters. Arm them, instruct them, intimidate them without seeming to, and leave them with the promise of swift retaliation if there is any deviation from the plan. Whatever arises in your territory, deal with it. If you can't, we will, and if we have to come and deal with it, then you have just compromised your position of power. This was oftentimes the unspoken reality, but one generally known and understood by all under DUDUS's rule and expansion project, the likes of which came with not just an undertone but more like a promise of swift elimination, a reality that no one wanted to face, and worked overtime not to. A development that led to what could be described in no other way, besides blind loyalty. A point that needs not to be overlooked here is that regardless of how intricate and deadly these individuals may have seemed when they left headlines bloody and readers grappled by fear, the truth was, intricacy was actually very limited. If anything, simplicity would have been the better adjective used to describe the modus operandi of these men. Violence without thought, it was what it was. But regardless how simple their structure of operation may have been, it was simple enough to not only work, but enough to leave individuals grappled with fear, and that alone was enough for links to be made, and a network created that blanketed the city of Kingston and eventually other areas of Jamaica. With the appointed and endorsed dons from various territories eager to play, do as the new don of all dons said, at the drop of a dime. In return for all the fringe benefits that came from being a part of such an infamous syndicate, it didn't take long for DUDUS to have, not only new territories under his extended control, but little robots at his disposal, quick to act on his every command. The alliances and affiliations may have finally been under one umbrella, but truth was, DUDUS was playing politics, even more than the real politicians themselves. With him being who he was, from day one he had inside information, so he was quite aware that the link did not stop at the borders of Western Kingston, but in the same breath, he also knew that beyond the borders of West Kingston, was where his power structure weakened. This was one of the key factors which he felt contributed to JRT's death, who simply was not safe outside of his territory. And with this understanding and newly formed alliances, DUDUS was hell-bent on changing that. Western Kingston has always been the backbone constituency of the Jamaica Labour Party. DUDUS knew that, but he also knew the power that had been garnered with the rise of the Shower Posse, and like it was once said in the streets back then, everybody wanted the Garden Link. Garden, another name for Tivoli Gardens. DUDUS was also quite aware of this. He had seen many outsiders come to Tivoli Gardens for favors of all sorts, and had also seen the benefits that came from granting such favors in return. And like the true businessman he was ready to capitalize, but just as with everything else, on an entirely different level. In many circles DUDUS is viewed as or held in the esteem of being some sort of wizard when it comes to gangsterism, but what many fail to realize is that as calculated as all he did may have seemed and been, all he was doing was making an admirable attempt to secure himself in the process. And rightfully so. Nowhere was safe. That was the reality of the day and also DUDUS's greatest concern upon taking control of the throne. His brother was dead, mainly due to an altercation that started miles away from their territory, and ending with him meeting his demise not too far from their power base. Something which should never have happened, but it did. He had also lost his sister, Mumbai, in an even closer proximity to home, and to top all that, it seemed as if not even jail was safe, because his father went in one way and came out another. Although he was a mere child, DUDUS was also quite aware of what many around him had termed the police murder of his father's forerunner and mentor, Claudius Massop. again killed within walking distance from his house. The issue of safety wasn't one-sided. All sides, JLP, PNP and the other, were counting their casualties. Case in point, Glenford Early Bird Phillips, area leader of neighbouring Matthews Lane, a PNP stronghold, and once the head of the infamous Spangler's Posse, and also a notable PNP activist, older brother to Donald Zeeks Phipps, the now incarcerated Matthews Lane Don, was also murdered in dramatic and suspicious fashion in his very home. His successor, an intimidating and giant-like character known as Cal, didn't fare much better either. He too was killed in downtown Kingston, again, a stone throw from his safe zone, while serving in the role of a supervisor, employed to the Metropolitan Parks and Markets, on Wednesday, July 15, 1990. Another notable gangster at the time was Wayne Sanderson Smith, who was accused of being the mastermind behind the attack on the Olympic Gardens police station in the mid-1980s. A move that could have convinced almost anyone that it was the inspiration for blockbusters such as Assault on Precinct 13. This incident, first of its kind, and still to date, the only assault of this nature with such results, left 3 policemen who were on duty at the time dead, and a cache of weapons and ammunition in the hands of obviously, some of the most ruthless men Jamaica had seen at the time. The incident rocked the nation, so much at the time, it is said that Michael Manley, then leader of the People's National Party, PNP, who was out jogging when the news broke, immediately jumped in his vehicle and headed to the community, arriving stupefied and in a state of shock. Law enforcement was irate, but none of the curfews and dragnets produced any results. And if that wasn't enough, there was an even more head-shaking twist to the entire scenario. Maybe even more than Copper, previously mentioned Public Enemy number 1 from the 1970s. Unlike Copper, who was loved by his peers and even respected to some extent by law enforcement, Sanderson was the polar opposite. He was Public Enemy number 1, yes, but with scorn. But law enforcement would not have the satisfaction of dispensing justice on him, neither in the streets nor in the courtroom, as Sanderson was found dead, after it was said that he was bringing too much heat on his cronies, who it is believed killed him in the Tower Hill community of Kingston, where his body was found with multiple gunshot wounds on September 8, 1989. Then there was Nathaniel Nathan Morton, another notable gangster who came to prominence the same year that Sanderson was killed. Like almost all gangsters, he lived and died by the gun, meeting his Waterloo shortly after escaping from Jamaica's Gun Court Rehabilitation Center in 1990. He was implicated in several atrocious acts of criminality after his escape, including murder, rape and numerous robberies, but eventually he too was cut down, this time by the police in Lakes Pen, St. Catherine, 8 months following his impressive escape. And note, these were the notables. All bodies were being killed a dime a dozen, every day, in almost every corner of the city, both by the police and by other forces, so DUDUS's concern about safety was real. Gangsters aside, this was also the days of the so-called badman police officers, who at times, it was said, acted outside of the law, in order to maintain the law. Names such as Keith Trinity Gardiner, Isaiah Lane, Amming, Tony Hewitt, Neville Benny White, Big Go Ford, Hux, One A Day and Cowboy come to mind. This was also the early days of an attempt to organize police teams for specific purposes, one main aim being to counter organized crime and gang activity. Teams such as the Eradication Squad, 1981, and ACID, Anti-Crime Investigation Department, 1993, are 2 of the more renowned or infamous departments of that era, depending on who is describing them, even though the concept was actually first introduced to Jamaica's law enforcement in 1976, with the creation of the Echo Squad, whose main task was to reduce murders. Unfortunately, the murder figures during their tenure suggest that the objective of this squad was never realized. Murder rates after their establishment and activation. 1976, 367. 1977, 409. 1978, 381. 1979, 351. Murder rates prior to their establishment and activation. 1971, 145. 1972, 170. 1973, 227. 1974, 195. 1975, 266.